Hello, people. Are the people there? Are the people in the house? I don't know if the people are in the house. We'll hope that they are. Well, great. Let's see if we have a fancy clicker. Uh-oh. Fancy. Oh, we gotta. For the fancy clicker to work, we have to have focus on the correct window. Do you guys want to see the talk ahead of time? Here's the whole talk. Whoops. Hope you got that. The slides at the end are not actually in the talk. So cut off like the last 8 or 10. I'm sure that was really good for Twitch's advanced compression algorithms. Would have been fun trying that in PowerPoint. Yeah, I just can't put up with PowerPoint enough to even do a slideshow in it anymore these days. It's just too painful. Someone asked, is the picture an ARG? No, but I bet somebody in chat could tell you what it is, maybe. There's no chai. Look, chai tea makes your mouth milky, which is bad for recording. Nobody knows what this is, really? Nobody? I have 0 people who know what that is. I guess it's kind of in a small picture in the corner. I don't know what that looks like at 1080p. I don't want to zoom in because I don't want to mess up the camera focus distance and stuff. don't have the Hollywood Enhanced software. Well, why not? I thought AI meant that you just point at your Dell computer monitor and go whoop, and it'll. Isn't that what deep learning does? Is it just. Somebody actually got it correct. Hey, how's the lighting in here? Is it good? I guess it's good, right? There's like sunlight coming in through the window. I guess that's good. All right, now I got to get some tea. Well, we'll just wait a bit. Like, I guess it's about 5 minutes till. My clock is usually fast, and we'll wait till about 5 minutes after. Like, I'll tweet us starting now on the hour, and then we'll give people like 5 minutes to show up, and they can always watch the video if they miss part of it. How long the talk will be? We'll talk about that. I'm not exactly sure. It's probably more than an hour. It's probably less than 90 minutes. And we'll do questions and answers after. Let me make sure. I'm going to need to go to some other things here. Let's test this. So everybody saw that, right? You didn't have a screw up. Not game 3. That's more like game 1.1. Yeah, the thing about coronavirus lectures is I think most of the ones that I've seen are there haven't been a lot of lectures, but there have been like panels and stuff. But usually it's people using really bad equipment, like bad mics and bad cameras and bad internet connections. If this internet connection goes out, we have had failures a little bit, but we are recording. I guess I'll say that once we start. A slight mismatch between audio and camera video. Let's see. Ready? That said, Twitch probably adds more variation than anything here does. All right, most people are saying it looks good. Okay, I tweeted the starting announcement tweet. So we'll start, we'll give people 5 to 7 minutes to show up. The great thing about giving talks at home is you can be prepared in a way that never really can happen effectively when you're on the road, especially in another country. So like I've got a hot tea here that hopefully I didn't oversteep. Hopefully I don't spill it all over the place into the keyboard. Hopefully you don't see sparks jump out during the presentation. So I've got that. I've got an aloe drink for the parched throat in the middle of the talk. I've got a glass of water. I've got cough drop. It's going to be great. I've got everything. So we're just waiting a minute or two. How we doing? Getting close to starting time. Put my phone on don't bother me mode. Welcome, everybody. We're going to start in just a couple minutes. It's a good idea to turn all devices off. Oh, this one's out of power, so no problem there. How many minutes now? We're now waiting for 2 to 4 minutes. Just want just a little more warmy warm, and then we go. Just a little more. That's the other nice thing about not being at an event, is I can just stand here and not say anything. But I wouldn't do that to you. Have I coordinated with Twitch? No. Dude, Twitch has banned me before. Like, I don't want to coordinate with them. What are you talking about? too many windows. We must clean up the windows. Dear Bill Gates, please clean up windows. Oh look, I have the stream streaming into a window that I'm not even looking at. Let's stop that. Hopefully I turned on the right display capture. I think we can start. Something like that. Let me adjust this. Microphone. All right, thank you everybody for showing up. It's great to have so many people here at my first speech I've delivered from home via video. One fun thing about putting something all over the internet is you don't know who's going to watch it and what their background might be, what they understand. So I don't usually put intros, but I'll do one here. This speech is a little bit unusual. I first gave it last year at a small conference that was interdisciplinary, so it's more geared toward people. I don't know. I don't want to say who it's geared toward, but just like for a general audience, let's say, right? And that original version of the speech was 36 minutes long, but I kind of blasted through it and, sped through some things that I thought could deserve more time spent on them, and I wanted to work on some of the explanations of some things. So I made a revised version of the speech here, and when I ran through the time, it ended up being 90 minutes. I don't know exactly how that happens, so I don't think this final version will be 90, but it'll be somewhere probably between an hour and 90 minutes. If you miss any of it, if that's too long for you, the whole thing will go up on YouTube later. We will do questions and answers at the end if you stick around in the Twitch chat. So I don't know how long the whole session will be. We'll go for as long as people have questions and or as long as I feel like answering them. I am a video game designer and programmer, and I run a company that makes video games, and I've been doing that for a long time. Professionally since 1996, and in an amateur way since I was like, I guess 10 years old, something like that. And well, I have a lot of thoughts about these things. I do not work in education, which will be obvious to most people as I continue on through the talk. So what I have to say here is the perspective from a video game person about where we can take education. Now, video games are a very modern technology, right? And so if I want to talk about a modern technology, it'll help me to do that by talking about the history of technology and just generally what the technologies that we've had have been like. So let's pretend that you're living in the old days, like the really old days, like you see here on the screen, and you want to learn some valuable skill like how to build a fire. But we don't actually have language yet. Human beings have not invented structured languages. Maybe you have some utterances, maybe you have names, but we don't have the ability to speak sentences because somebody had to invent that, right? This is a bit of a hypothetical because we don't actually know historically which came first, the advent of structured language or the ability of man to create fire. But we're just going to say for now language came later, even though it quite possibly could have been the other way around. So you want to learn this valuable skill, and how can you do it if you don't have language? Well, human beings are very good at mimicry and at watching another person perform an action. You know, we have sympathy neurons that go off in our brain when we see other people doing things, and that's a big part of how we learn. You know, non-linguistically, right? Without anyone even explicitly teaching us, we can learn things just by watching them, right? And so if you were to learn a very basic skill like how to swim or how to run, you know, that's not so hard. Something like fire that involves many steps and is a little bit technical, may be harder to learn, but you could do it through sustained repetition, right? The problem is that without language, there's a little bit of a limit to what you can do, right? Somebody can show you how to make fire, but only with the ingredients at hand, only with the environment at hand, right? If it's raining right now, I can't really show you how to make fire. I could just kind of pantomime, right? But once you have language, you can ask questions. You can say like, hey, I don't understand this part, or could you repeat this part? Or what if it's really windy? What do I do? Or if I'm off beyond the forest in the east, where do I find kindling? Because the environment's different over there. And we have this more sophisticated way of communicating once we've invented language, right? But that shouldn't let us get on our high horse and think that language is superior to demonstration, right? Because if you were to imagine that somebody tries to build you a fire tries to teach you how to build a fire without showing you anything, right? It's just like, I'm just going to tell you, dude, here's how you build a fire. You get a stick, you get another stick. They're about yay big. You like rub one really fast. You can get extra torque by doing this, right? Make sure this one is dry, get kindling, whatever. You try to explain all these things. That person is probably not going to be able to go out and just build a fire without a great deal of trial and error, because this whole, this entire large section of their mind has not been shown how to do things. It has not seen something that it can mimic, and it didn't intake that visual information, right? There's a tremendous amount of information, tremendous amount of bandwidth worth of visual information that comes in when you watch something that isn't encapsulated in a textual explanation like that. And so we have to see that language is not strictly superior to the demonstration that came before it, right? Mimicry is very effective sometimes at some things. Language is very effective sometimes at some things. A fusion of mimicry plus language is superior to either one alone, right? When you can interactively ask questions, the guy can tell you what's more important, what's less important. That is the best way that we know to learn. And a lot of things today, most things, especially things that are taught one-on-one, are taught this way, like martial arts, sports, you know, anything like that, especially things involving the body. I want to be very clear that this is a metaphor for what I'm going to be saying about video games later. Video games are a newer technology, right? We should not assume that video games are strictly better at any particular thing. We should expect, as we see in other examples, that in fusion with other things, they create the best result. Oh, yeah. I tried for the most part to keep a picture from cutting off slides, but this slide was added at the last second, and I didn't do that. Sorry. Anyway, so once you have structured language, you can suddenly use it to do a lot more things. So instead of talking about this hypothetical situation of where do I find kindling beyond the forest in the east, you can now talk about situations so hypothetical that they never have existed and never will exist, right? You can create fiction. You can have this job of storytelling where people build skill at spinning elaborate fictions. And we all know that stories are very entertaining, but they're also educational, right? Which is one of the reasons why human beings love stories so much, if you dig down deeply enough, right? Now, the thing that stories are educational about historically is a different realm of subject matter than something that you can directly show or do mimicry on, right? So mimicry happens at very short time scales. Like, I'm watching you swim, I'm watching you build a fire. But stories can be on longer time scales, or they can encapsulate knowledge that was collected over longer time scales. So for example, or that, let's say, they can encapsulate knowledge that in the absence of the story would require a long time scale to collect yourself. Let's not belabor that. Anyway, so one example, historically we have fables, we have stories with morals, and the goal of these was to try to indicate this is correct moral behavior that has been societally decided, or at least decided by some small to medium-sized group. And sometimes this was hard-won knowledge, right? If you're just living your life for, it might take you decades before you're able to assimilate enough experiences to where you have a mature ability to observe a situation and respond in what we would consider a morally advanced way. And what stories do is try to get you to that morally advanced point faster. Now, after you've got structured language, you may figure out how to write things down after a while, right? And that again changes what you're able to do with language, right? Because it gives you a kind of precision that you never had before, because you can say what the exact words are rather than the general idea, which would have the exact words change from telling after telling in an oral tradition, right? So you say, these are the exact words. They're not going to change. And so we can be very specific, for example, about what the law is, right? So you can make a law that doesn't change. And then you get this meta ability that arises from that, because it's not just that the law doesn't change, but that everybody knows that the law doesn't change. And that adds trust to the idea of the law, and it adds objectivity to the idea of the law, right? In an oral tradition, maybe the law is just whatever the king decided to say this week, right? I mean, he has to make laws all the time anyway, so maybe if he's mad at someone, he's just going to change this law and throw the guy in prison or something. But once you have written law, you can say, no, look, this law clearly is not about this situation because it was written 20 years ago in stone. It's objective and trustable, right? And so even though these are all different categories of language, they have different abilities. Now, on the one hand, all this stuff that I'm saying, it maybe seems kind of dumb and obvious, I guess. But on the other hand, all these things are things that we take for granted today. Every day, we're just drowning in all of these technological capabilities that we've developed that we don't even think of as technologically based abilities anymore. They're just natural to us, right? And so part of what I want to do is just stop and look at these things and just observe them in a way we don't usually and see what their properties are, because those might tell us about games. And part of what I want to do is make the case that games today, if I start saying wacky stuff about games, that they could be used this way or they could be used that way, and this would be an advancement in technology. I just want to say that we've done this before with other topics in a lot of different ways, and so to expect it to happen with games in the future is not unlikely. All right, so writing advances, and we find other things to do with it. So here is a page from Euclid's Elements, right? Once you have writing that lets you explain something in an unchanging way and in a way that's very precise and specific, you can start exploring things and communicating knowledge in those realms that would have seemed too intangible and hard to grab onto before, such as mathematics, right? But there are several levels of technology at which you could even do that. So here's a passage from Euclid's Elements, and if you were trying to learn math back in the time of Euclid, this would be what you were trying to learn, a ton and ton of things that sound like if a first magnitude has to a second, the same ratio as a third has to a fourth, and also a fifth has to the second, the same ratio as a sixth to the fourth, and the sum of the first and the fifth has a second, and so on and so on. If you don't like math class now, try this math class, right? That's what it was like until at some point we developed the technology to actually write mathematical notation, right? And so this that you see on the screen right now, this if A over B is C over D and E over B is equal to F over D, then that sum on the bottom line, that's the equivalent of this giant page of text, but it's actually much more understandable if you've been introduced to mathematical notation. If you haven't, it might look a little bit cryptic, but once you learn it, it's actually pretty simple. And in fact, this entire paragraph from Elements is something that's so simple, we wouldn't really even bother to teach it this way today, because the symbolic manipulation of mathematics is so powerful that we teach kids the manipulation. You see this line on the bottom is just like, look, the way we explain it to kids is like, look, if you want to add two fractions, you can do that. You can add the numerators if they have the same denominator, right? That is a more general rule that encapsulates this case and many other cases. And so once you have that, you're much more powerful than somebody who's trying to memorize a bunch of these things. However, again, that is not to slight this technology here, because this technology is a tremendous advancement over what we had before that. Anyway, coming up with mathematical notation was pretty hard. It took us a long time to come up with the idea of writing plus as a symbol. That was first done in the year 1360. And apparently that was so hard to come up with that it took us another 130 years after that to come up with the idea of minus. But then once we could write plus and minus, then, only after another 50 years, we started doing square roots. And then the cat was out of the bag and we sort of saw the pattern and how to do all of these different kinds of writing of mathematical notation. And if you get to the present day, you see equations that look like this. And this is it looks scary if you're not used to Greek letters, I guess, but it's a very terse equation that is very important. And understanding of it is greatly aided by our ability to write things in mathematical notation the way that we write them today. If you were to try to write this equation back in the way that Euclid did, well, it probably depends on what exactly the rules are of what concepts you're allowed to use and what you're allowed to write, but it's probably many, many pages. It's possibly a whole giant ream of pages just to explain what this equation tells you. And it would probably be really hard to understand. It would probably be a lot harder to study, a lot harder to learn, right? And so that is the difference that this technological advancement has made between these two cases. And now the point to make is mathematics is sort of the same, right? The knowledge, the kind of knowledge that we're trying to learn in both these cases, actually especially this case versus this case, because it's really the same. It's the same mathematics, but the technology that we use to approach the mathematics can make the learning of the material and the practice of the material have a tremendously different flavor, right? And the flavors that we've discovered these days are very advantageous to the flavors in the old days. Now, language evolved in other areas besides strictly pragmatic ones, right? So the telling of fiction has evolved. So if you read a novel, like a modern experimental novel, it's going to be very different from something like the Iliad, right? And novels, every author has their own style of what they're doing. It's a medium that has a tremendous amount of expressivity. They often will play with basic elements like plot and character and mood. Authors will pick style, like, do I want to write in a very direct style? Do I want to write in a florid and descriptive style? Do I want to change that based on what character is active in the novel, or do I not? Do I want to experiment with the structure of the whole novel, of how these abstractly shaped pieces that the reader never really directly sees, how those things fit together, right? All of those things are active in a modern novel. It's been the form has experienced a lot of progress and a lot of experimentation. And then, of course, we have something like music. And I want to go into music because I've been talking about novels and I'm going to talk about movies in a second. And we all know that those have stories in them. But what I'm talking about today, or what I want to get to talking about, is a kind of communication that doesn't rely on language and that isn't about story or character or anything like that. And so purely instrumental music is a good way to visit that kind of communication in a way that we're familiar with, to explore what it can do. And so I'm going to do a really dumb experiment right now, right? Which is I'm just going to play, this song and just take it a minute to do this exercise of just listening to it with the goal of seeing what music is like how does it communicate? How does it feel to listen to music? And on the one hand, this sounds kind of dumb because we all know what music is like, but on the other hand, it's relevant to what we're talking about. It's useful to turn your attention there. And actually, this is a practice that you could spend your whole life doing. So I'll play this for a second. Of course, it's a computer and I didn't turn the volume up. It feels like a crime to shut something like that off, but we're going to do that for now. I encourage you to listen to it later, not in the middle of a bunch of talking. But we can just make the point that that is a very different kind of communication than this or this. But there is communication happening there, right? It's a different flavor. It's a different kind of communication. And of course, film has its own kind of communication that, much like novels, incorporates elements like plot and character and mood, but as well has its own elements that are unique to its genre or that it shares with neighboring genres. So there are things like acting or lighting and cinematography and the music that is used to score the movie and many other elements, right? That's what makes cinema cinema. And people who work in cinema have figured out how to use those elements very effectively over the past many decades. But again, this doesn't mean, of course, that cinema is superior to music alone or to novels or to anything else. They're just different, and you do different things in the different media, right? Again, there are trade-offs. So if you wanted to make a movie about a guy who's paralyzed by decision-making, he's having some intricate thought process about whether or not he should do a certain thing this way or that way, and he's not really talking to anyone about it, he's just thinking about it. Maybe you shouldn't make that a movie, right? Maybe that should be a novel, because that's an area where novels do quite well, is explaining internal thought processes, where movies are quite poor. Or if you made it a movie, you might make it a less literal movie and a more symbolically evocative movie that translates internal thought processes into visual things, but in doing so, you would be changing what the story is about, right? And so you have to respect these different media. You have to respect that the media are different from each other and all have their strengths and all have their weaknesses, right? So, yeah. So when we get to video games, we should be looking for this, right? I've just gone through a bunch of media and said that they all have their strengths and their weaknesses, and that should be the same for games. Games should be better at communicating some kinds of things that other media can't do. Otherwise, games isn't a medium, right? And figuring out what those things are might be difficult because we wouldn't necessarily have an example of other media doing them well enough to call them out as a specific mental thing, right? That might be our job, is to discover those things. Now, at the same time, we should expect games to be worse than other media at some kinds of communication, because that's the way everything is. Every medium has things that it's not good at. Now, one of the things that I think games are pretty good at, and that I've had a good time exploring, is non-linguistic communication, right? Getting ideas into the head of the player without words. And that is it's an interesting capability that I think all games have, including, non-video games, but old granddad games, right, even have this. But it's something that is a lot more natural for video games and is being explored much more rapidly in video games. So here's an old style board game. And if you want to learn to play a game like this, you read a rule book, right? And hopefully the author of the rule book tried to be concise and keep the rules simple and all this stuff. But you need to read this to know even what you're supposed to be doing. And then, often it'll be complicated enough. You have to stop and read the rules in the middle of the game, and you'll be confused about what's correct and all these things. Now, that said, this is an advancement in technology, right? Once upon a time, we didn't have the ability to write in this specific of a way, so you probably wouldn't have had a game like this back before we had that capability, but the capability to write gives us the capability to have this kind of game. Now, the capability to program things on integrated circuits has given us this other kind of game. And the early games in the arcades actually kind of had rule books like this. They were simplified for people with short attention spans, right? But they sort of had stuff like, hey, this dot is worth 10 points and the big dot is worth 50 points. You can't see it because it's blinking off right now. And these are the different ghosts and all that. But this is not really how anyone learns to play Pac-Man, right? I mean, maybe you start to learn by watching your friend play or whoever's ahead of you in line, because back in the day, arcade games often had lines. But mostly you would learn to play Pac-Man by playing Pac-Man, right? And you start out and you realize like, oh, I start eating the dots and they go away and my score goes up and a ghost hits me and I die and all that sort of things. Like, oh, I eat the big pill and the ghosts turn blue and run away and then I can eat them. And these are all discoverable and in fact quite rapidly discovered in a game like Pac-Man. And this is not only an ability unique to games, but an ability unique to video games. You can't really do this kind of learning with a board game because a board game doesn't react to you, right? A board game just sits there. A video game reacts to you, and that ability to react to you creates this ability to learn in this particular way. Now, as you become better at the game, the things that you learn become a little bit more advanced, right? So like, after you've played a few times, you might realize, oh, the early levels are pretty easy. So I don't really have to worry about dying too much. And instead, I'm going to try to maximize my score. I'll just like hang out near this corner and bait these ghosts over to me. And then I'll be right there ready to get the pill. And I'll get it at the last second when the ghosts are closest to me, which maximizes the likelihood that I'll be able to eat all 4 of them and get tons and tons of points, right? You get good at that kind of thing as you get better at the game. And the things that you learn become ever and ever higher order as you keep going until at the end, you actually know a great deal about Pac-Man, right? If you were to write down everything you knew in linguistic form about Pac-Man, it would be many pages at least. Like by the time you explain the kinds of patterns you would run early in the game versus late in the game, where in the game you really have to start worrying about staying alive in a more or less careful way, what the different, navigation patterns of the different ghosts tend to be. There's just a lot of knowledge like that, right? Even in a simple game like this. But Pac-Man is tremendously simpler than most games today, right? Today we have these giant games that people play for hundreds or thousands of hours. And what does that do? Well, it means there's a whole lot more to learn in these modern games, which should be instructive if we want to talk about learning and talk about how games can be used for learning. Now, usually, when people are going to make an example that video games can be effective at learning, they would pick, like an educational game that was mildly successful, or by some criterion, or Pac-Man or something. But we want a modern game that's complicated, and because I like a challenge, I'm going to pick a kind of game that's usually denigrated, that people would say doesn't have societal value, right? There's not a kind of game that people would say there's not educational value in, that there's not moral value in, right? And I'm going to try to show you that there is. So I'm going to pick this game, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, which at this point is waning in popularity, but it was pretty popular a few years ago. And the scenario in this game is, well, it's a multiplayer game, and there's about 100 people who parachute down from the sky and land on this island. And as you can see from the picture, the job is to attempt to shoot each other. And you do that by scrounging around. In the beginning, you have nothing, and you search all these buildings and try to find things to fight each other with. And whoever's alive at the end of the game is the winner, right? And so usually this would be classified as a violent video game and tossed out of polite discussion as like something that's not worth considering. But if we want to take games seriously as a medium, we have to understand the medium, right? And we have to take things very seriously. And in fact, if there is something that games good at, if there is something that games are very good at that we can leverage for education, we probably should be able to find that thing that games are good at in most games. Otherwise, they're maybe not that good at it. You know what I'm saying? So let's talk about this game for a second. So like I've said, people may play this game, if they're into it, for hundreds of hours or thousands of hours. That's not too unusual. But they're not doing a mindlessly repetitive activity that whole time, right? They're playing iterations of a game that has a very large, what we call a state space, a very large space of possibilities of what could happen. And they're playing different iterations with different configurations in that space. That's not a very easily understandable way of explaining this. I'll just say, there's a lot that can happen in a game like this. And as you play it over and over, you see the kinds of things that can happen from different angles and different scenarios. So one time you might land on the west of the island. Another time you might land on the east of the island. One time you might land in a place where a lot of other people chose to land. Another time you might not, right? And so you do this over and over. There are different islands in the game, right? Like if you play at a certain time of day, there might be a lot of players from Korea in, and they might have different strategies that they use. And so you start to see the space of this game over and over from different perspectives. And that builds up in your mind a view of this very complex, very nonlinear possibility space of this game. And you're just doing it over and over, right? So, well, just like with Pac-Man, you start to learn what's a good idea in various contexts. You start to learn, well, at the beginning of the game, when there are a lot of players alive, but most of them are poorly armed, this particular kind of strategy or behavior might be beneficial for me to engage in. But in the late game, when there are many fewer players, but the playfield has contracted and everybody is very well supplied, I want to behave in this other kind of way, right? And you start building up this knowledge of this game through iteration after iteration after iteration, right? And it's a little bit like practicing science or, some kind of empirical philosophy, because you get to form your own ideas about what's a good idea to do, and then you get to empirically validate those ideas, right? So you might say, hey, in the mid game, if I'm in an open area, I want to try to do the following thing when the zone closes. Let me try that. Maybe it didn't work this time, but maybe part of observing this space over and over is realizing that there's a random element, like there are in games like poker or something like that, and to realize when you got dealt a bad hand. So you might say, well, I'm going to keep trying that strategy, and maybe after I've tried it 15 or 16 times, I'm going to see generally what's true about what was beneficial and what wasn't beneficial, and then I'm going to draw some conclusions. And that is how you become a better player, and games are trying to make you a better player because they have a score or a victory condition, right? Okay, now the thing about this is the amount of time that you can spend playing and the number of repetitions lets you see a much more complex shape of, what is the behavior of this system of the game than we normally have been able to get in the past. Even in the time of Pac-Man, the system of Pac-Man is much simpler than the system of PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. And so as we've been building these more complex games, we've been giving people the ability to explore these more complex systems more directly, right? And well, this kind of revisiting a situation over and over from different angles and in different contexts is normally the kind of learning that people get from life experience and that we consider to be very valuable, right? So if you wanted to learn how to farm from some guy who's been farming from decades and he's trying to convey his knowledge to you, he might say a lot of things that are hard to understand in the beginning, like, look, if you get up in the morning and the weather is this particular way, go do this thing. But if the weather is like slightly different in a way that seems kind of the same to a beginner, that means something totally different, and go do this other thing right away because that's critical, right? And it might sound nonsensical to you or just illogical or inconsistent or too hard to understand. But what actually happens is experts build very detailed models of these highly nonlinear state spaces that contain surprises, right? That contain sharp turns, that contain, what I mean by a surprise is, maybe there's a low probability event that can be very significant if it happens, or maybe there's a very nonlinear response where, you do a particular action and usually the system responds in a particular way, but once in a while it responds in this totally other way, right? These are the things that we learn over time by engaging and re-engaging with systems. And so because of this, I say that all games are educational, right? Pac-Man, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, even regular old educational games, right? But we don't think of most video games as educational, and the reason is because they don't tend to have real-world applicability in the way that we want educational games to have today when we say it's educational, right? So when I've learned the rules of PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, those rules mostly are only valuable in that world, right? I probably shouldn't try to fight in the real world with the tactics that I learned are most effective in PUBG. And that's why on this slide, I put empirically validate in sarcasm quotes, because you're empirically validating things for that particular universe, but the validity of those conclusions may not, and probably does not survive if you map it onto the real world, even if that toy universe of the game seems similar in some ways to the real world. And this is actually both a barrier to making educational games, but also an opportunity. All right, so back when I started working on this game, Braid, I hadn't developed this line of thought about non-linguistic communication, but I was open to it. I was very interested in just seeing what video games can be like when you experiment with them and what makes them better and what makes them worse. And I wanted this game to be as good as possible, right? Just like when you're playing a game, the fact that you want to do well causes you to learn things, right? When you're making something, if you want it to be the best thing that it can be, that causes you to learn things. And so as I was working on the game, I learned that somehow the levels got better the simpler they were. This is a puzzle game, right? And the ideas behind the puzzles would come through the game more clearly when the levels were relatively stark, when they didn't have a lot of details that were irrelevant to the puzzle idea, when they didn't have a lot of, extra challenges like little monsters that you had to get out of the way of in order to do the puzzle. The game works the best when it's pure and there's just a particular situation and that's very simply described on the screen, and you're just like, what is this? And you have to figure it out. And so over the course of the game's development, the designs of the levels iterated from more complex level geometry and more interactive elements toward the design that we see in the game today. And this actually took a little bit of willingness to be untraditional, because usually if you're designing a game, you're very concerned with people being entertained by your game. And entertainment means challenge. It means throwing a bunch of stuff at the player. It means giving the player a lot of things to grab their attention. And in this game, it was like, actually, no, we want less things grabbing the player's attention, because many of those things are distractions, and distractions reduce the clarity of transmission of the ideas of the level. That's how I thought about it by the end of development. I didn't have those ideas that clearly in the beginning. So when I started working on the design of this game, The Witness, I was very interested in this way of communication that I had seen in Braid, and said, I want to make one of the top agenda points of this game to explore this method of communication and see what we can do with it. In this game, you wander around this island that you see here, and it's full of puzzles, and a lot of the puzzles look like these LCD screen things that are in the environment. And you walk up and you can trace lines on them. Here in this picture, we see these puzzles in a solved state. But normally you would walk up to this row of panels and just the left one would be lit and the rest of them would be unlit, and you solve it and it lights up the next one, right? And when you come up to this first panel, the game doesn't tell you anything about what to do. It doesn't say, hey, these black and white rounded rectangles mean a particular thing. It just lets you interact with it and figure that stuff out. And so when you try to solve this puzzle, there's really only three things you can do. You can go the top, the middle, or around the bottom. And, the middle one is right. And as soon as you solve this first panel, a magical moment of non-linguistic communication happens that I'm still fascinated by and still want to understand as best as I can, because it's not just that you gain a logical fact that this particular path on this particular puzzle resulted in a solution state of true, right? That is not the only thing that happens, because the layout of this puzzle, right, the way that it's formatted tells you something. It's not really a definite thing, but it's like, oh, there's something about the symmetry of where the line is, right? And the spots being, polar opposite colors. Something about that is suggestive. And as the player, you don't exactly know what any of that means, but we managed to build upon it, right? And so in this second puzzle, it's saying an idea that adds on to the first one. It's saying also, by the way, you don't necessarily have to start in the middle and go straight between. You could start in one corner and go to the other corner. And then the third puzzle here says, oh, there could be more than one spot on one side of this group that you're drawing your line around. And so the way that I think about the game is that every puzzle has an idea like this. Usually it's an idea that you could express in words, but that's not really the way the puzzles were designed. The puzzles were designed to be non-linguistic, right? And so something interesting happened. which is if you go up to someone who's new to the game and is working on the last puzzle in this sequence, and you ask this person, like, hey, what are you trying to do right now to solve this puzzle? Often, not always, but often, they'll be like, and they'll start to try to explain it to you, and they won't know how to explain it, what they're doing. They'll start to say, well, you know, I'm trying to draw this line between these things. They'll hesitate a lot and get facts out like, you know, I think I need to go clockwise and not counterclockwise because of this, and I'm not sure what the blank spaces mean here, but I think I can do this or that with them. And it might take them a couple minutes, and then they can eventually coherently explain to you in full sentences in normal human language, like exactly what they're trying to do. And that was fascinating to me when that started happening, because what that meant was that all that information was in their mind, but they didn't know how to put it into language because it didn't go in via language, right? It went in simply through this interactive loop that you have, you know, between the game and the player. Now, that doesn't happen with everybody, right? So some people, and I'm not exactly sure what the percentages are. I didn't keep careful data about this, but some people will just be able to explain to you what they're doing. And I think the difference is that some people, when they're working on a problem, like reason to themselves about what they're trying to do and explain internally to themselves, like, I'm trying to blah, blah, blah. I mean, I do that when I'm trying to solve hard things sometimes. So I think, you know, sometimes people pre-verbalize and do that work, but sometimes you can catch people before they've done that, and then they have to verbalize in the process of explaining to you. And so that was confirmation to me, if I needed it, which I didn't really, but that kind of experiment in this game was confirmation to me that games is its own medium. It's not just pictures and sound and controls. Why? Because we're able to get ideas into people's minds that didn't come through the pictures, that didn't come through the sound effects, that didn't come through, you know, linear language, right? Is a different thing. And if we want to use games for education, we want to understand this thing and a few other things as well as we can, and see what its properties are and figure out how to use it the most effectively. So what is this thing, this way that we can communicate non-verbally, and how can we apply it, right? We should expect, again, just like some media are better at communicating some kinds of knowledge than other media, we should expect the same to be true with games. We should expect that there are some things that we can communicate non-verbally way better than other things try to communicate verbally or linguistically, right? But then we should also expect that games are not good at some things, right? Now, another thing that fascinates me about games, which you can see, again, in games like PUBG, is that players can gain competence without knowing specific facts. There's a sense in which they learn in the opposite direction of how you would learn in school from books, right? So if I'm playing PUBG, I might know, for example, that the AK-47 hits really hard, but it's hard to control the recoil. So maybe I want to use that on players that are up close or in certain types of terrain where there's lots of cover, so that I can, you know, so I don't get into a long range engagement. But you know, the M4, it doesn't hit people as hard. But I'm gonna pause for a moment. People are saying F. Are we back? I'm going to pause for a moment and wait for people to come back. Tell people to refresh. We'll just cut this part out of the video later. We're okay? All right, so I don't actually know where we were, so I'll just say that again. So you might know in this game that the AK-47 does a lot of damage, right? It hits other players really hard, but it's hard to control the recoil, and it's hard to add things to it to mitigate the recoil. And so you maybe only want to use it in scenarios where you're not going to get in a super long distance engagement, right? But it could be much more effective than other things up close. But then you might know, oh, but the M4, it doesn't have nearly as much recoil. It fires at a higher rate of speed, and each individual round does less damage, but it's effective at longer range, and I can get more attachments for that, right? So these are all things that you know from playing PUBG for a while, but you don't actually know the numbers, right? You don't know how many points of damage an AK-47 does versus a player with level 3 armor or a player with level 2 armor versus what an M4 does in either of those cases as well. Like, the actual invisible rule set of this game is very, very complicated if you take into account all the numbers. Like, what are the numbers that, you know, actually control how much recoil happens when? And, you know, how well do players understand that? Almost no players understand that stuff very clearly, but they're able to deal with it, right? They're able to gain competence here. Now, if you were to learn this kind of stuff from books without doing it, you would have to go in the other direction. You would start out reading a book saying, an AK-47 does this many points of damage at this range and this much at this range, and that's affected by armor in the following way, and recoil increases at blah, 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 or decreases at blah. It would be just like the most boring math or physics class that you've ever been in, and it would take probably years of studying that material before you would get the kind of intuition that you can get much more naturally by playing a game like PUBG, right? We would much rather play it to get the experience than read the books to get that experience. And that's a clue. We can use that, right? We can use that to make education better. And so the general point I want to make is, of course, not just about shooting games. It's about anything. Any subject that takes a long time of instruction before you can get to a point of understanding and expertise where you have the actual intuition about that subject, right? Maybe you can get to the intuition much faster with games as opposed to having to assemble it piece by piece, page by page over time with text, right? We might be able to get to places in games much more easily than books can get to, or in fact, that books can't practically get to within the lifetimes of people. Now, that said, as I've said a few times, games aren't going to be better at everything, right? Books are actually better, for example, at communicating precise facts, because again, the writing doesn't change over time. You can throw a ton of very precise numbers on a page, and people can go very easily flip to that page and read them. And even if you have a game that's pretending to be a book, you have to like boot up the game and get it into a particular interactive state. That's just different from like picking up a book and turning it to the page, or like taking a photo of the book so you have it on your phone conveniently. Like all of these things, they just work better for books, right? Now, sometimes games do contain like bodies of knowledge like this inside the game, but I don't really consider them like that's a point at which games are kind of mimicking books as opposed to doing the things that are in the wheelhouse of the game itself, right? So when I talk about the special powers of games during this speech, I'm really talking about the things that games can do that other media cannot, right? And so you can kind of pretend to be a book, but I think it's substantially less good than an actual book, right? So just like the analogy of building a fire at the beginning of this talk, you actually want both of these things at once in one educational program, right? You don't want to replace all books with games, because games aren't good at everything, right? But you want games to be there. And in fact, I would say you want them to be there first. I think we're going to talk about this in a little while. We'll come back to it if I forgot. So now, of course, we have educational games today, not just entertainment games. There are lots of educational games. They're almost always completely terrible, right? Nobody really likes to play them if they don't have to. Why are they terrible? Well, there's lots of reasons. But I think the biggest reason is this failure to understand the different media, right? I'm gonna keep saying this. It bears, like, it's the key point in some way. Like, taking this very seriously is one of the key points of this talk, right? Which is, again, different media communicate different ways. They communicate different types of information or different types of knowledge or understanding with different levels of effectiveness, right? Depending on the flavor of the knowledge. And usually when somebody goes to make an educational game, they're taking something that we already teach with books, right? Or in-person instruction. And they try to just embed that information in a game and then try to make the game more fun by having it be like an interactive way to get to that information. And that's actually fundamentally incorrect, right? You shouldn't do that. And the reason you shouldn't do that is because, again, the space of what you can easily understand or effectively or efficiently understand from books is different from the space of what you can effectively understand in games. If you want a book to be good, you try as best as you can to make it a good book, right? If you want a game to be good, you try as best as you can to make it a good game, which means you need to play in the area that games are good at, which is something that books don't really know anything about. So if you go to a book, or if you go to an educational program that was structured to be taught through books, that structure was iterated over time to be effective when taught through books. And you're trying to bring it to games, and it's a completely inappropriate structure, right? And so this is really why most educational games are bad, is they're trying to take a book-shaped peg and fit it in a game-shaped hole. And you're just going to make a mess if you do that or break things. It doesn't work very well. Okay. Now, one of these things that we think, and I'm going to try to change your mind about this a little bit. But one of these things that we think almost implicitly about what it means to make an educational game is that you're trying to take specific information that we want to teach people and put it in the game, right? I'm stepping back one step from saying it's information that came from an existing educational program or from an existing book. And I'm just saying, well, if you want to learn, physics or something, here's a set of things that you need to know, right? But again, the thing about games is you need to stay in the space where games are good. And being too on the nose about exactly what information you're trying to put into the game is dangerous. It can easily result in a bad game. And so if I were to go teach things, like for example, if I were to go teach programming in my own little private programming school, I wouldn't do it the way that high schools or universities in the US do it, certainly. I would start people out in a different way. I might give them a little bit of introductory material that's in book form, but after that, I would start them on games like these games from Zachtronics, which anybody can download and play on the PC or maybe some other platforms. Here's one of my favorite games called Shenzhen.io. And in this game, it's sort of a puzzle game, but the puzzles are open-ended. It's more like, how successfully do you accomplish these particular tasks? You're trying to build a circuit board in this fictional universe that accomplishes some particular task. And you can build the circuit board by laying down these chips and routing these lines between them and also making little assembly language programs on each chip. Now, this is not an educational game. These are not real chips. This is not a real assembly language. And in fact, that's actually part of why it's a fun game, is because it's not an educational game. The assembly language in this game is so limited in functionality that it's comical, right? It's kind of hilarious. And it's kind of hilarious how feeble these little circuits are, especially compared to what we have today, right? But that's kind of funny, and it's what makes the game fun, right? And the constrained problem space that's like cleaner than what you have in the real world makes it more fun to play around and experiment. But again, it's not a toy, it's goal oriented. You're trying to achieve goals, and the fact that you're trying to achieve those goals makes you work hard, right? Especially after you've, supposedly solved a particular level. You've got something that does the job, but you're like, that was hard and my solution is really ugly and I could barely do it. And I just don't like what I did. And then you look on the scoreboard and one of your friends has a way better score than you. Like his thing runs in way fewer cycles or he used way fewer components. And you're like, how is that even possible, right? And then you go back and iterate on your thing and you're like, oh, I can make this improvement over here and that's better. And then I can make this other improvement over here and that's better. Oh, and because I did those two improvements in tandem, that opens up this possibility over here. And you see this way that you could rapidly iterate from something that's kind of terrible to something that's really good. And then at some point you may say, wait a minute, now that I see this differently because my solution is different, I realize I could do this thing over here that actually makes those first three improvements completely unnecessary now because those components are gone, right? And that's the experience of playing a game like this. It's really fun and really interesting. Now, what are you learning, right? I've said that all games are educational. Well, you're learning this fake assembly language, fictional assembly language. You're learning this, simplified chip routing thing. But actually, I think the most important thing that you learn from this game is something that is very, very valuable. And that is the spirit of engineering and the spirit of programming and the spirit of problem solving on an engineering problem like this. And I think it is taught very, very effectively in these games. Much more effectively, in fact, than in school, right? And so, there are people who graduate from the college where I went, which is a top computer science school in the US. There are people who graduate from there with a bachelor's degree who have no real concept of this true spirit of engineering that I'm talking about. Or in fact, people with PhDs don't even know. It's something that our educational system is not very good at teaching. But when you experience it in a game like this, you can bring that experience to the real world, right? You're not going to bring this assembly language to the real world. In fact, if you're working in assembly on a real chip, it's usually much more of a bummer because it's this giant, ugly, bloated, terrible thing, right? But after you do something with these systems that are very complicated and very hard to deal with, it might remind you like, oh yeah, it's kind of like that time in Shenzhen IO when I did that really ugly thing. But I improved that drastically, and so maybe I can do that here, right? And even if you don't explicitly think that, our minds learn by example. They're good at forming new patterns based on the things that we've seen and the things that we've done that are successful. And so it can actually affect you at a very deep level and get you something that would be very hard to get, right, through a traditional computer science school. And so I think this is actually very valuable as an educational game in a way that is unacknowledged, right? It is unacknowledged because we're looking for the education in the wrong place. We're looking for the education in terms of knowing about specific circuits or specific programming language, when the actual education here is the deep spirit of engineering, right? And that's way more important. So here's another game by Zachtronics called Opus Magnum. I can show you just a little image of what this looks like when you successfully solve a problem. Where are we? Here we go. So, wait. Oh, there we go. So this game, it lets you output little animated images of your solutions so you can be proud of them after you've done them. And it's really nice. Like, this is a relatively efficient and clean solution that I came up with from what seemed like a very hard problem at first. This game, it's, the fiction behind it is that you're making these little nanomachines. It's in a world where, alchemy, the rules of alchemy are governing these little tiny particles and not the rules of chemistry. And so obviously it is not trying to be too on the nose in terms of the things that it's teaching. It's just chemistry-ish, but you like kind of put atoms together and form bonds and break bonds and again, solve problems in the spirit of engineering. But here the problems tend to be more spatial and about the sequence of what occupies space over time. And it's just really fascinating. Like you also program the moves of these little manipulators, these little gray arms that you see moving back and forth. And, it's probably a little bit better about education. Like if I wanted to use this as an educational game, it's probably a little bit more about programming or general engineering than something like chemistry, but it can impart a little bit of understanding of chemistry, or a little bit of motivation to think that chemistry is cool, right? If you spent 100 hours playing this game doing cool stuff, you probably have more appreciation for chemistry than if you never did anything in chemistry and then you show up in a boring class one day, right? And so if you start to think about what an educational system would be like if you had these little things all over the place that aren't all trying to do one specific thing, but it's like, oh, this is mostly programming, but there's a little bit of coolness vaguely about chemistry here. You can imagine the aggregate effect of all of these things being quite large in terms of the motivation of people to learn things, or of the amount of context, the amount of understanding that they have going in. All right. Last game from other people I want to show here is this game called Miegakure, which this one is not out yet. The previous games are out. You can go play them. This one is not out. Hopefully it'll be out sometime in the future. This is a puzzle game where you walk around these small puzzle worlds and you try to push blocks around and do things to manipulate objects in this space. But the trick is that the space is 4-dimensional spatially, right? And not 3-dimensional. And this isn't the weird thing that people like to cutely know about, where like, oh, time is the 4th dimension in Einsteinian space-time. That's not what this is. This is actually 4 dimensions of space, and you can only see 3 at a time. So I'm going to play the beginning of a video from that website to sort of show you the flavor of this game. This doesn't really show you problem solving in the game, but it shows you kind of what it's like to move around and shift dimensions. Now, on the one hand, that is not very explicitly educational, because when are you going to need to know about manipulating 4 dimensions of space? But on the other hand, in terms of both the spirit of what you might be learning and just in terms of developing advanced skills, this is very advanced, and it can get you to a very senior level of ability very quickly, because you want to solve these puzzles in this space. And so you try hard to visualize this space that is 4-dimensional, right? Like if you're a high school math teacher and you manage to get a significant proportion of your students to be able to even try visualizing things in 4D or be enthusiastic about that, that has to be just like a rousing success in that context, right? But in games, we can do that very quickly, like almost immediately, and people enjoy it, right? Now, this isn't going to teach you like theorems about math in dimensions higher than 3, but it gives you the feel of it, and it gives you the experience of playing with it. It gives you both instinct for what kinds of things can happen in 4 dimensions, and it gives you inspiration because you had fun with it. It gives you motivation, let's say, right? So that's what's fascinating to me here too, is that this is the kind of thing, this is representative of the kind of thing that advanced mathematicians do, right? Advanced mathematicians try to think about or visualize all kinds of strange spaces, or what things are constructed by particular configurations of mathematical rules. That is something that takes many years of study to get to the way that we teach it right now. But this game shows us that we can get there much more directly, at least to portions of that, right? And then maybe if we start building that educational structure, it will also reveal some neighboring portions that we don't even know are there. Oh, one more game. Mini Metro, right? This is a game about building a subway system. It is an extremely simplified and idealized subway system in a very idealized map of a city. And I wouldn't ever put this forth as a thing that would replace any kind of book that teaches you how to build a real subway system in real life, right? But that's not what it's trying to do. It is trying to capture the essence, right? The spirit of what this kind of transit system design is like in a very simplified way, in a very accessible way. But that's interesting on its own merit and fun, right? Like I have no plans to ever become a transit designer, but I can play Mini Metro and enjoy it because it's not really trying to be an educational game. At least I don't think so. I don't want to put words in the designer's mouth. But anyway, of these games that I've covered here, all 4 of these are just really good games in their own right. And they're games that I would use educationally. But really, that's not because somebody designed them to be part of a curriculum. It's because they found the value in the subject matter and found an effective way to communicate that value to the player. All right, so I want to show something that I've only shown a small number of people on a couple of occasions, which is my own attempt at making an educational game. I did this about 9 or 10 years ago. It was 2011 or 2010, and it was early in working on The Witness. I just had this little side project where I wanted to say, if I was doing an educational game, you know, what would it be like? And well, we'll talk about that a bit. I do want to say this is not something that I've actively been working on, right? It's something I'm digging out of cold freeze from a long time ago. Well, and let's just look at it. And so that we get full screen, I'm going to turn the camera off for a second here. Bam. Oh no, that's the wrong thing. Bam. All right. Don't turn off the actual screen. Okay, so this game was going to be maybe a sort of a knot tying game or something like that, where the things that you manipulate are all lines, and you can change the directions of the lines, right? So, well, and also their positions sometimes. So I have this little handle, and I can drag this thing up and down. You know, that drags this white line up and down with it. And then, you know, this yellow line, I can't really control that one, just this white one with this red handle. But where they intersect, it makes a little interactive point here, and I can click on this, and it maybe twists the lines around each other. Maybe we would have a nice tying things together animation or something. You know, when you work on video games, one of the things that you do like later on is make it look and feel nice, and early you just try to get the concepts down, and that's what I was doing here. So after I've tied these together, as I sort of move this line up and down, the point moves up and down as well. Now this particular level doesn't have much more to it than that, but of course we can start a second level that has more stuff, and suddenly we have a lot more choices about what we can do interactively, and we can try again what we did before. We can like twist these guys around each other this way and see what happens. But then it's like, okay, wait a minute. Usually these interaction points were on intersections, but I as the player can notice that like now there's one like between these. So what happens here? And you do this thing where you kind of make a new little white ribbon and tie it across these guys, and you know, you can just sort of start playing with it. Now, the degree to which I made this game already, I was still experimenting with what the rules should be and how it should work. And so it doesn't have explicit goals yet, but the goals were going to be something like, you know, just try to get the line to go between some goalposts, you know, out on the edge of the level somewhere. Or, you know, there might be additional things like, hey, you know, to make a point like, hey, how many times can you make this thing bounce back and forth as you have these things cross and change directions, right? Or try to make something that you've never seen before. Like maybe there's a goal of a certain type of thing landing up here, and you're like, what's that? And you realize, oh wait, I can click on this. That's different and interesting. I've never sort of done that, and then whoa, and then what's that, right? So you can explore, as the player, you can explore and start to learn the system and start to see what these different kinds of interactions do with each other, right? And so now the punchline of this game is that it's supposed to be just an interesting game about this weird rule set of tying together knots and stuff, except, the first thing to say is that can be very interesting in its own right, because when we go to make experimental video games with new designs, that's one of the main things we try to do, is try to find some set of gameplay mechanics that are different from what people have explored before, or to explore them in a different way, right? But the punchline to this is that toward the end of the game, it would be like, hey, now you know some stuff about particle physics, because all these things that you've been doing are actual particles from the real world. And that would just be a funny thing to do. And maybe someday I'll still make this game, but since that may not happen, I at least wanted to show it here. I guess some people were saying that I've shown this somewhere before, so maybe there's some other talk online where I show this too. Now, again, it's worth pointing out that the subject matter that you would end up naturally exploring in a game like this is different from what you would do in the real world if you were trying to be explicitly educational, and you should allow it to be different in order to get the best game possible. So this thing that I showed with like lots of bounces, can I get more bounces? There we go. This thing that I showed with lots of bounces would correspond to a very low probability event if you were looking at actual Feynman diagrams or something, especially because, this that we're looking at right now has one spatial dimension instead of three spatial dimensions like you would have in the actual world, right? And so this type of situation is much easier to create in a little game universe and much easier to gravitate toward, which makes it different from what you would do in a serious study of these phenomena. But that's okay, because what you're doing is you're building familiarity and you're building intuition, and you're just making a fun game that gets people excited about the subject and wanting to know more, right? And so you should allow it to be different. You should allow it to be whatever makes a game good. All right, let's get back to the slides. This is a note to myself, which I remembered, thank you, but it's always good to have a note. All right, so what I am talking about here is about harnessing this ability of games to communicate in this subtle way. That is not the way that games have usually been applied to education. And it's not the kind of thing that people usually do when they think about applying games to education, right? There's this term that was concocted sometime around 2010 called gamification, and people think that this is the kind of thing that you use to get people interested. And this term annoys me so much. I'm going to try to explain why. I'm showing this graph here of interest because I sort of thought that this was something that spiked around, the early 2010s and went away kind of, but it apparently hasn't gone away. I guess lots of people in education still think about this. Really a lot of people making bad websites where they want to keep you glued to their bad website. Think about this. And yeah, it's weird. I don't know why people like gamification so much in Utah, but apparently gamification is big in Utah. Well, what is it? Well, it's this idea that you can use some of these elements from games like achievements or badges or other kinds of rewards, and you can use those to motivate people and get them to do the things that you want them to do that are otherwise not that fun, I guess, or that they wouldn't otherwise do. And I think this is really bad for a lot of reasons. Let me try to explain. First of all, this stuff didn't come from games, right? This kind of thing about giving out achievements and badges and rewards has been around for hundreds or thousands of years by people who did it better than video games have done it, right? If you're in the military and you get a medal, you probably did something really serious to get that medal. And the military knows that. They don't give them to everyone, right? They know that the reason that you get respect for having a medal, the reason the medals are valuable is that they don't give them to everyone, right? They give them to people who earn them. If you get a medal in a video game or on a website, it's like, it means that you at least were able to breathe through your mouth long enough to stay alive to get the medal, but it doesn't mean much more than that, right? And so these are things, first of all, that have been done better in other places. And not just militaries, like you have organizations like the Boy Scouts or Cub Scouts, I don't know, this is Boy Scouts, copying that, right? You have, airlines have been doing this forever, where you like get frequent flyer miles and level up. All of this came before this gamification trend. So why are people saying this came from games when games like actually added it later, right? The things that are true to games have been around since, well, video games especially, have been around since Pac-Man or before, whereas this thing is actually something we got from other places and did badly. So gamification is weird. And you know who else does all this stuff in addition to airlines, grocery stores, armies, and whoever? Schools have already been doing this for a long time. And so if your plan about how to improve education is we're going to bring gamification to schools, they've already been doing this forever and they're better at it than you. So what are you talking about? This isn't going to solve anything, right? It's just a bunch of I don't know what it is. It's the product of people who are not thinking very carefully about what is going on. And so, schools are already full of this kind of thing and have been for a long time. And you know what? A lot of kids have trouble being engaged. Schools are boring a lot of the time, right? So maybe instead of calling this stuff gamification, we should call it schoolification, first of all. So why would you schoolify your games? And then why would you schoolify your schools? Like we're trying to bring schools into the future. If you have a problem, so here's the thing. The reason that actual video games, not this weird layer of rewards and badges that we've pasted on top, but the reason that actual video games are enjoyable and that people like them is because human beings have a drive to explore, they have a drive to learn, they have a drive to get better at things, right? And games, when they are doing well, hook into that in a deep way, in a significant way that lets them learn things and lets them become better at things, right? Somehow, so this technological advancement that we've performed that gave us all this great writing and language that has allowed us to do things, we never completely got mastery of it in terms of when it came to teaching it. So we have all these schools where people are, even though they're supposed to be learning, they're not like engaged in learning, they're not enjoying learning. This drive of the human to learn is not kicking in those environments, right? And so that's the problem, right? The fact that this kid is like asleep in class is the problem. And if you have a problem like that, like if the boards in your house are like the wood is rotting, you need to replace the wood, right? You don't paint over it and say, oh, it's better, right? So if school is like this, you need to re-envision the school so that people's natural desire to learn is engaged. You don't want to put a bunch of fake stuff over the top to try to trick them into engaging with the material, right? So when a game like this adds all these layers of like, oh, you're level 55 and only 100 more experience points to level 56, and you have this many of this points and this many of these other points and this many trillion banana points, like, this is the boring part of what we do. People don't play these games because of this stuff. Now, speaking of matters of cynical manipulation of human beings, I do think these things are effective to some degree in getting people to behave in a certain way. But this comes at a cost, all right? It comes at the cost that people know that they are being manipulated. All right. And it comes at an opportunity cost. So let me talk about that. Oh, wait, actually, let me talk about this. So Alfie Kohn has this book called Punished by Rewards, wherein he presents a very interesting viewpoint about how these kinds of reward systems can actually be very demotivating, right? And do more damage than good, and actually do very serious damage. This book was written a long time before this whole gamification thing happened. That's how long this kind of stuff has been going on in schools. I don't know, maybe hundreds of years. I don't know what education was like a couple hundred years ago, but he makes a very good case. Now, I can summarize it. You should read the book, but I can summarize it by saying that human beings are cognitively sophisticated, right? We know how to read what's going on. So if you're going to bribe somebody, like if you're going to bribe me to study a subject, right? If you're going to bribe me to pretend I'm interested in a subject, I know that it's probably not that interesting without the bribe, right? I know that I need to be bribed in order to do the thing, so I know that it's probably not something that I should be wanting to do, right? Or if I'm performing some activity, well, we'll just say the other thing that happens in these scenarios is you shift why students or just whoever is doing the behavior, right? You change the reason why they are doing things, right? If you want to train really good scientists, you need people who are interested in science, who really like the idea of being good at science, who have positive mental and psychological associations with science and the way science is done. And if you try to bribe them to get through the science track instead, you're changing what happens in their mind, right? And you're raising people who are trying to get the rewards and not actually trying to get the learning. And so, I don't know. I didn't just do a very good explanation of this. Maybe I'll try to do it again at the end, and we'll cut that into the video. But it's a book you should read if you're interested in these things. So the other thing I have to say about gamification is it doesn't mean anything. I've spent most of this talk talking about the way that games can convey information, the way that they can communicate. And when you say you're doing gamification, that's not the part of games that you're using. You're using just this part that's a carrot on a stick tied to the donkey, right? To keep the donkey going forward. And that doesn't mean anything, except of course, because people are cognitively sophisticated, it means that they're being manipulated and they know they're being manipulated, right? But it doesn't mean anything besides that. And so you're kind of paying an opportunity cost where you're taking this channel that could be a serious conveyor of deep and interesting meaning, and you're turning it into something that's doing something else. And so you're losing that channel. All right? Now, I've described games as being complex systems several times in this talk. And I think that one of the things that games can do is help you develop systems thinking. Let's talk about what that is for a second, right? So some of the subjects that we want to teach are about complex systems. So for example, if you want to learn economics, right now the way you do it is by reading a whole bunch of books that make assertions about how economic systems will behave in certain scenarios when certain forces are applied or certain constraints are applied, right? That's the same kind of thing that we learn in games, except we learn it a lot more directly and intuitively, right? So economics is an example of a study that is fundamentally about how systems behave, and we're teaching it in this way that we've said is maybe not that good. It takes you a long time to start to get to the intuition that you would have of a system, whereas maybe a game can take you more directly to that intuition, right? And systems are becoming more and more important because, as our technological power increases, our ability to shape the world has increased, and well, we don't necessarily have complete grasp over all our systems right now, whether they're environmental systems, political systems, economic systems, or even just technological. Like we have this huge system of technological research and production that I don't think that we're managing very efficiently or very well right now. So systems literacy is becoming something of an emergency. It's important in a way that it's never been in the past. And so we need to develop systems literacy society-wide, right? We need to train people in systems thinking. And the way to do that is by engaging with systems, right? And so I think you could do way worse than to have people play a lot of video games, to put it frankly, at least the systemic kind. Now, there are certain kinds of video games that are not about systems. For example, linear story games or any kind of game that's like a linear sequence from one piece to another that doesn't give you really much choice about how things play out, or where the way things play out is controlled by if statements as opposed to systemic interactions, right? And, you know, a decade or two ago, I used to think that I was a little bit in the minority because I valued the systems part of games, and I didn't really like these games that were pretending to be movies and being all linear and stuff. And because those seemed to be the biggest money-making games of the time, you know, all these AAA console games. The thing that's happened, though, is the biggest games in the world are these system games now. You know, stuff like Fortnite, right? Fortnite is not a linear story-based game. It's a complex system game, like PUBG, like I was talking about before, but maybe more chaotic than that. But so, if you take people who play one game and observe that system very carefully and intensely for a while, and play another game and observe that system, and play another game and observe that system, we can get to this kind of meta-knowledge of systems where you kind of understand how systems can behave, and you respect systems, and you have a feel for things that may happen. And that's very important, right? Because then when you're in some novel system, whether it's an economic system or something else, you can get a little tingling of your spider sense, right? You can be like, oh, I don't like what I'm looking at here because this reminds me of these other times when I saw very nonlinear, surprising responses to inputs. I don't want to provoke that here. And there's a very big difference between reading about surprise nonlinear responses to inputs a few times until hopefully you've been told and will remember that. There's a big difference between that and experiencing it a few times and like being burned hard once or twice in fictional universes by this thing, right? You'll carry a different respect for it and a different understanding. And so there's this meta-system awareness that that certain people who have played a lot of games have, that we could be giving to a lot more people and we aren't. And that is a shame. Because it's a waste. We have this capability that we need and that we are not deploying. Now, whenever I have a talk and I say a bunch of idealistic things about games like this, people are always like, oh, there's problems with what you're saying and blah, blah, blah. And yes, there are. I want to confront a few. Problem number one is that realistically, the educational system will never go for what I am talking about. Let me move my picture. Whoops, not that. No. The real problem is that computers are terrible. Okay. So problem number one is that what I have described is, if you take it to its logical extension, it's very unconventional. I'm saying, hey, you need to understand that games have a certain way of communicating. You need to respect what that way is. You need to respect what it's good at and what it's not good at. And you need to look for the things that it's good at, which, by the way, will not necessarily interact heavily with what we are currently teaching and will nevertheless be very valuable, right? Now, the problem with that is we have huge systems, both in my country and around the world, that are very invested in propagating the kind of system that we already have, in part because people know what works to the extent that it works. And I'm saying we should go do something that is not known to work at all. And that's all seems irresponsible, especially if people look like they're having fun while they're doing these things. And of course, the second reason is that large organizations always part of their job becomes survival and self-perpetuation, because that's why they still exist, right? And so the traditional educational system is not really going to go for the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Fortunately, due to the technology of the internet, we maybe don't have to worry about that much. Because what I've been saying is that these games should be enjoyable on their own, regardless of the supposed educational content. And so if a game is a fun game, people might just want to download it over Steam or the Epic Store or somewhere, right? And if we start doing this successfully in a number of cases, enough that you can look at this and see that a non-traditional kind of education is happening by putting all these individual pieces together, then maybe at some point traditional education starts looking like cable TV from the 80s or 90s, where people had to buy all these bundles of cable TV channels, and they're like, I don't want to pay for all these. I just want these ones over here, the good ones. Of course, now nobody watches cable TV and everybody watches YouTube. So problem number 2, what about this signaling that people get from school? A lot of people go to universities or high school even, really, for the social status and not for the actual learning. And I don't think we should try to solve this problem right now. Firstly, because I think it's more important that we determine actually what games are good at and how we can use them. And that should come before trying to build a full educational system out of those things anyway, or something that would replace anything. But secondly, I don't think these are the people that we should worry about, right? So I mentioned before that I went to a top computer science school. I did not actually graduate with a computer science degree. I was very close to graduating. I only had about 1 semester of classes left to take, and I just left because I couldn't take it being in school anymore. Like, I was depressed being in school. I felt like I was dying inside being in school, and that I would be much better outside of school. Now, I lasted till my last year of college, but a lot of people don't, right? Our current system is not serving a lot of people very well. Many of those people are very smart and very industrious, and they just don't fit into the thing that we have. And so I think you could do quite well just by looking for and addressing those people with this new kind of educational game, and worrying about the traditional system a little later on. It might honestly fall apart on its own at some point. And maybe the real deepest problem is it's really hard to make these games. Like we've said, most educational games are bad. What do we do about that? How do we make them good? Well, A, pay attention to the issues I was talking about. But B, we're sort of at the hardest point of trying to attack this problem right now, because we don't have a tradition of people who are building the knowledge of how you do educational games well, of what kinds of things work, of what don't. We don't have that many examples of things that work that you can draw on when you're doing something new. And once you have a tradition of practice, it has a kind of momentum of its own that can help you make headway and solve problems. Now, it's not easy to build a whole tradition of people, especially because we're starting at 0. And I literally mean 0. The stuff that I'm talking about how to use games here is sufficiently different enough from what's actually happening that I'm not aware of anyone in the world who is actually doing this seriously full time. Not even me, right? I've dabbled in some of this stuff, but I'm working on other stuff right now, right? And these authors of these other games are, they're making games that, like I've said, have a great deal of educational merit, but they're not making it with the eye of building this kind of tradition and this kind of institution. And so we need to get maybe some people started on that. And then it'll take a long time. Like, you have to build the building brick by brick, but there are at least some easy places to start. There's some low-hanging fruit. There are some subjects that might be easier to teach than others, right? Or some subjects that seem more amenable at first to communication via games than others. So anyway, to recap, what have we said about games? They convey their own kind of information that is different from the kind that come through other media. They're very good at imparting intuition, maybe not so good at imparting concrete numbers, but maybe that's actually fine and good. They teach you how to think your way through problems because they're interactive and you have to decide what to do on the spot. They teach a kind of empirical validation that is kind of like science. They allow for freedom of inquiry because, again, we didn't really cover this, but again, because they're interactive and systemic games tend to be nonlinear, you can decide which part of the system to go do right now. I don't think you should try to replace books with games. I think you should augment an educational system by using games with books, and probably use games first or earlier, because you get to intuition that is very hard to get to in a traditional way. So if any of this sounds unconvincing to you or like something you can't take action on, then I would just like to say, like, well, that's because it's really early, because we're not using games in this way right now. And when we haven't done something yet at all, especially if it's actually a new technology, nobody knows what it looks like. And we don't have the example to draw from. We don't know what it's going to feel like when it's actually a thing, right? And so because it's the future, it's hard to see by definition, right? I do think that we can end up with a system of education that is much more effective than what we have right now, much more engaging, much more thorough in some aspects, and that is not cynical in the way that gamification wants us to be, or the way that these school rewards want us to be. But I do think that that's in the future. And, I called this video games in the future of education, right? I didn't call this talk video games in the present of education. And the reason is because it isn't very easy to see the things that I'm talking about. And so I would encourage you to think about it really hard. Or maybe not really hard, but really thoroughly, or with good energy and good motivation, because I think there's a lot to do here. And again, I want to end by making the point that, things that seem small or that seem tenuous in the beginning can end up being quite large and quite impactful and huge, right? So imagine, again, we're back in the old days. Like, you spent the day learning how to make fire, right? At the beginning of the talk. And now you're hanging out with some friends in a cave, like having some beers or something. And you've been painting on stuff today in your spare time. You've been painting on trees and rocks and stuff. And now that you're in the cave, you have the idea like, hey, I'll paint some stuff on the wall of the cave. Not really because people live in caves, but like, you're like, hey, maybe it won't get rained on and this painting will last a little bit longer, right? And, you start painting things, and you had this idea the other day that you want to explore a little bit more about actually trying to draw pictures like less well, in some sense. You want to draw things, like, it's hard to draw things that look like the thing that you're drawing. It's hard to get the colors and the shape and all this stuff. But you found this other way to use your pigments, right? Like, like there's this little girl, from the family that lives next to you. Her name is Sue, and she wears her hair in these pigtails, right? And if you like draw her head with these really big exaggerated pigtails, people know it's her. Whereas if you draw her like with realistically scaled pigtails, they kind of fade into the rest of the shape, and people don't know it's her. And you've been thinking about that, and you're like, wait, we could use this. But the other guys are drunk, and you're trying to explain it to them, and they're like, why do you want to draw less well? That's stupid, man. And you're like, no, because like the picture of Sue could actually, it kind of means her in some way. Like, it could be like, kind of like a picture of like what her name is. Like, it sort of does the same job as being her name, but like in a drawing, like, isn't that a trip? And they're like, oh man, whatever. Like, that's stupid. Just learn to draw better. You should learn to draw better. And you're like, no, man, like, look, if you draw a dog, but you draw the legs really clearly with like if you draw the claws and stuff, then people can tell it's a dog. Whereas if you draw it and it's like gets on a rock and it gets rained on, after a while, it's a smudge and people can't tell what it is. And they're like, yeah, great, but whatever. People just don't listen to you. And so you go off and you keep working on this, right? And maybe someday you develop some simplified ways of drawing things that are a little bit more iconic and a little bit less realistic. And it's, they see limited use, and then they see wider use, and then they see wider use. And over time, these things evolve into a more streamlined form where they become even more iconic and even less literal. And you're finding both you and your descendants and the people for generations who have been employing this system that started very tenuous and very minimal and very simple, have found, by virtue of occupying this conceptual space, ways to elaborate on the ideas, make them more effective, make them more efficient to use, make them more efficient to communicate with, until in the end, you end up with something quite sophisticated with a tremendous amount of nuance that you wouldn't have been able to imagine in the beginning, and that are usable to a great degree of effectiveness by a very large number of people, right? That's how all these technological advancements start. And so if we have an opportunity like that in games, we should take it seriously, because it could really could really become something. And so the thing to realize is that we're just at the beginning here. We haven't even figured out how to make really these pictures at the beginning of the road. We've sort of started to figure out maybe pieces of a couple of the shapes, but we're not even at this point that you see here. But getting to that point, the possibility of getting to that point means that you live in exciting times, and that this could be an interesting thing to think about. And that's it for the formal part of the talk today. Thanks for sitting with me. It did end up being 90 minutes. I apologize for that. I'm going to refill my water, and then we will take questions. Back in a minute. I'm going to sit down for the... Oh, I don't want to sit down because then I'll have to re-aim the camera. It's over there. Okay, I won't sit down. I'll make the picture bigger because we've seen all the slides. But I might refer to previous slides, so... All right, so questions you can direct to me with the @ sign. What do I think about adding games to the mandatory reading playing list in schools? I think if they're mandatory, that's already a little bit of a mistake, but could be effective. But the real question is, are they good games? And are they doing what you want them to do? Where can you get one of those cave beers? Dude, you can bet that people had mind-altering substances before we had writing. Come on, how do you think we got writing? Uh-oh. My laptop just froze, everybody. So oh, wait, it's back. Why don't I say Miyagakure? Oh, it's Hamish. Why don't I see Miyagakure as being in this tradition? Because there's a difference. So Miyagakure is made out of enthusiasm for four-dimensional geometry and for exploring that, which is a little bit of a different thing than explicitly trying to give people a takeaway like you would with an educational game. It's a subtle difference, and part of what I'm arguing, I mean, on the one hand, I'm sort of arguing it's not a traditional educational game. On the other hand, I'm saying, well, traditional educational games aren't good, and if you're going to call your thing traditionally educational game, it's maybe not going to be good, because the things that we use to identify those games are the things that make them bad, right? But so I think to be in that tradition, you have to know that you're in that tradition and be working on the tradition, and you'll just end up going a slightly different way than we are already going, if you know what I mean. Am I sure it doesn't teach you theorems? There are things that I will know are possible or impossible. I mean, it might teach you theorems that you could help, or it might it might facilitate you discovering theorems about the world for yourself, but it doesn't really guide you through the. Of course, last I played was a long time ago, and who knows, it might be different now. Did I ever use the logo turtle in school briefly? Have I read Mindstorms? Nope. I have aphantasia. Do I think that changes the sentence is a little bit grammatically weird, but do I think that changes the system that people have in their head? It may actually. It's very hard to talk about highly subjective things. From a game designer perspective, how do you begin to explore this space? Game development takes a lot of energy and time. How can you optimize this process? Okay, the one thing I have to say about that is actually take seriously what I was talking about. So a lot of game designers, even good game designers, do not take seriously that there are things that video games are bad at and things that video games, even particular designs that you might come up with. It's actually not that hard once you've practiced a bit to see which parts of the designs are not good, right? But people, and you need to cut those away, right? Because especially if you're doing something weird like being educational, you need to be able to cut those away and replace that piece of it with something that works better. And people just don't do that almost ever. It's weird. And you need to be quite dogged in your pursuit of that. It kind of needs to be like solving a puzzle in a Zachtronics game like Shenzhen IO, right? Let's flip back to that. Uh-oh, I'm in the wrong window. Who knows what's happening? So, in this way that we were talking about, that you iterate and maybe you realize that stuff that you thought was smart before isn't necessary anymore because you have a better solution. You need to do that with your game design. And most people don't. And that's one reason why I think this kind of a game is very, very valuable, because it can teach you the value of doing that, right? Again, everywhere, not just programming, but like design, it can teach you the value of, not thinking your first ideas are super good, because if you think they're super good, that places a ceiling above which you cannot rise. You know what I'm saying? Since books have traditionally been the preferred medium for teaching narrative in schools, is there a place for games to supplant or replace them? For narrative, no. Games are terrible at stories. They're one of the things I was alluding to when I said that games are bad at things. A lot of the examples of games given provide in the direction of STEM. I think it's possible for games to be educational with regard to social linguistic skills. Yes. Yes. We have fewer clear examples of those, but for example, there's a piece of Frog Fractions 2 that's about communication in a fundamental way that's interesting. There's an interactive fiction game called The Gostak that's about communication in a way that's interesting. Those things didn't quite occur to me when I was thinking of games to talk about here, but I could have put them in this talk. Should music and movies also play a bigger role in the future of education? It's an interesting question. Like, I would say yes. I mean, if anything, that's a way to be disheartened about the traditional educational institutions. Like, when I was in school, we definitely had movies that were a little bit educational and stuff. In some areas more than others. So, for example, in physics, we would watch the Mechanical Universe videos, and like those were all cool and stuff. But there wasn't that much of that compared to how much there could have been. I don't know what it's like, obviously, to be in grade school now. But I mean, I feel like a tremendous opportunity was squandered even back then. So maybe that same thing will happen with games. I don't know. Do I think there is a parallel between the subtle things games teach you and the things you learn from crafts? A little bit, but there's a big difference because the games that I'm talking about have systems that were explicitly authored to communicate, whereas crafts were not really specifically authored to communicate. They were authored to be an interesting way of making things that have interesting properties in the end, right? And that's a different thing. Do I have any thoughts on gamification's impacts on the logistics of teaching? By that you mean how one-on-one teaching can be very effective, but not feasible for everyone. Can gamification affect this in any way? I mean, gamification is not what I was talking about. I think that's a bad word, as I said. So I'm not sure what you mean. I'm not sure if you're asking if gamification can ruin teaching or if non-gamification uses of games can improve teaching. So maybe we need a more specific question there. I think computers can add something particular to games that couldn't be done without them. Yes, I talked about that in the talk. You can go rewind it. The perfect example game for this talk is Kerbal Space Program. I actually don't think so. I mean, when I tried to play Kerbal, the physics was like so janky that it was, I don't know. It was just too hard to play. Maybe it's been improved. I don't know. I'm going to take a minute to re-aim the camera and sit down because I've been standing up a long time. Okay, this is going to be a weird angle. If it's too weird, I'll move it again. But that's another advantage of doing a talk at home is that you can just sit down if you want. Anyway, the reason why Kerbal's physics being so broken bothered me is because it's a game about physics. You can't really have super broken physics in a game about physics. Like that fundamentally doesn't make sense to me. Here, let me fix the camera a little bit. Okay, maybe that's better. My head's not sticking off the top. Oh, camera's crooked. Who cares? We're rolling with it. Doesn't simplifying things in games somewhat lie to the person, give them the wrong idea of what it's really like? No, not if you don't claim that that's what it's really like. That's the key, right? If you claim that is what it's really like, you're lying. And I agree that that would not be good. What would you consider to be a maybe naive but actionable approach to moving the needle on this? Sitting down and trying to make a game to teach, like bartering, for example, and just trying to make it better. Well, again, I think, so this is a thing where establishing a tradition would help, right? Because again, I think it's very difficult and not very fruitful to sit down and try to be too specific about what you're about specific ideas that you're trying to convey. You want to build a system that's like the system that you want to talk about, and then see what's interesting about that system that you built, right? Which is a very different approach than most educational games do today. So if you want to do a game about bartering, obviously you need some way to barter, and then you need some things to barter, and then you need to put that together in a way that's interesting. Like, what is it about barter that's interesting? Is it that some goods are perishable and some aren't? Is it that some goods are larger and others are smaller? Like, what is it? And maybe you can explore all of those things. Like, just find some things that are interesting like that, and then build those points of interest, and then see what the system does. This blog post presents evidence contrary to my use games before books mentality. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to sit here and read this on stream. I have a feeling I disagree quite strongly with what's being said here, but I'm going to have to go read it at some point. And again, I mean, there are screenshots in here of educational games that look terrible. So like, I don't think that you can study the effects of bad educational games and come to valid conclusions about what good educational games would do. That just doesn't make sense to me. But yeah, I'll read that later. You're curious what subjects I consider low-hanging fruit? I don't know. You just start playing with it. Like, see what works for you. Like, different people have different ideas about what they like to explore and about what they find easy to think about, or what they're most motivated to think about. What's my take on non-systems learning in games? For example, historical stuff and some strategy games. I think that can be very helpful. For example, I would have learned a lot more in my high school history classes if I'd had some exposure to that stuff through games. I would have at least had context for all the different things. But at the same time, that doesn't really get to the heart of what makes games interesting, right? It's a useful aspect of games that we might be able to use, that people like games. So if you have a game in a historical period, then people maybe can absorb something about that. But I don't think, I think if you're really trying to develop the technology of communicating via games, that's more like a side cul-de-sac than the main thing that you should be thinking about. What do I think about Minecraft as a kind of educational game? I mean, I'd have to see how it's being used to answer that question, I think. Thoughts on using games to teach language? There have been a number of games that I've seen that kind of try to teach language, and I haven't seen anyone do a good job at it yet. It's hard because I would say that that's not low-hanging fruit, because you need people to speak really in order to learn a language. And well, unless you're just trying to teach the written language or something, but it's not usually what we want to teach. And so you need people to be able to speak And you need the nuances of what they say to matter, because language is about nuance. And like having a program do that, it's just very hard territory. I think games are great at teaching the rules piece by piece at a certain pace to make sure players not overwhelmed. It's fine-tuned by playtesting. In education, on the other hand, you're usually given a bunch of rules, and then they say do the exercises. Do you think that would be a good application of game design and writing books, courses? I mean, maybe. I mean, the thing to realize is, like, educational programs are paced in the way that you're talking about. It's just that pace is not really adjusted on a per person basis usually, right? So when they give you a bunch of rules or equations or something, that's usually the little nugget of equations that, that they felt was necessary to get you through the material in a certain amount of time, right? Do I think you can make a good educational game in the systemic sense if it is designed to have a specific message about the system? Probably not. That probably makes it very hard because, again, when you contract to a specific message, you're throwing away a lot of what is good about games, which is the ability to see this possibility space from many angles in many ways. Oh, hey, Casey. Do I think there is an underlying issue involved in allowing children to explore learning themselves because the kinds of adults often involved in education have a vested interest in controlling the conclusion at which the children arrive? I mean, that's a complex topic, obviously. I haven't thought about that one very seriously yet, right? So obviously, I've certainly been aware my whole life because it was part of the cultural knowledge that educational institutions are also indoctrination machines, right? Like we know that, and just try to maintain our individuality throughout that time or something, right? Can we reduce the degree to which these are indoctrination machines, or can we give you a choice about the degree to which you participate in that or something? Maybe. I think that making education more customized and individualized and interactive might help with that. And that, like, if you think about that, okay, there are different time scales on which societies compete, right? And there are cultural, there are aspects of every culture that affect its ability to compete in one way or another that may manifest at different timescales. And we have this thing where, Americans are, for example, in principle, less conformist than some other societies and stuff. Or we have more of an idea of individuality being a good thing, or at least we used to. We may not have that anymore. But then we still have this indoctrination process that runs counter to that individuality, in which it's very important to participate in if you want your advanced degree, right? And so I guess what I'm getting at is that may actually be hurting us in the long term. Maybe it doesn't hurt us that bad because most people in the world are doing that. But if you actually wanted to break through to the next level of educational performance, maybe what you actually need is open competition between different levels of indoctrination into what and to what degree and to what degree of choice students have in that, and just see what outcompetes what. because America is supposed to be the land of letting people out compete each other, right? And that might allow you to get to something tremendously more effective than what we have. Now, at the same time, I've been using the word indoctrination, which is often used in a negative, but I mean, sometimes it's positive. Like, you know, like the flat earth people in that flat earth documentary probably feel pretty unindoctrinated, but it's a negative in that instance. And so figuring out what's right is difficult and an ongoing process, right? So I don't know. That's what I think about that. Do I think there's a deficiency in the medium of video game to convey story plot in contrast to theater, for example? Yes, games are terrible at story. Games are terrible at story. I'm skipping over some questions that I feel like were just covered in the talk. So, you know, if you got here late and I don't answer your question, maybe you can go look at it again or something. Is there a space for medals when they only recognize hard and worthy goals? I think so. Like there's some things that matter, like if I've played PUBG, right? The number of PUBG wins that I have, because it's hard to win, that matters, and I care when that number goes up. And so there is a place for that. It's just way overused. Is there a way to make on the nose game? For examples, what if the game's just, let's do some math. We just allow the user to click around a little more. Well, again, I would argue that if you're doing that, if you don't you need to let the game slide into the space where it is the best. And that will inevitably involve it sliding away from your starting point a little bit. And you need to be able to accept that and know that that's going to happen and let it happen. And that's what I meant by, like, if you keep things too on the nose, it's like you're hammering it into the backboard and not letting it move. And that's not good, actually. Would I call gacha games or VNs games? Not really. They don't, I mean, they're video games, right? But they don't get to these communicative aspects of video games that I'm talking about in any especially deep way, I should say, right? They're not trying to do that, for sure. But like I said in the early part of the talk, all games contain this kind of communication to begin with. When am I releasing the quantum mechanics game? I don't know. I might make it someday, but I have too much happening right now to make it. Do I envision this tradition as requiring involvement from existing experts in order to validate that the essence of these disciplines is adequately captured? I mean, it depends who the experts are. I mean, could that be helpful? Maybe sometimes. The problem is existing experts are experts in the existing thing. And what I'm saying is that if we do a good job, we'll end up at a point very, very different from this existing thing. And so some of that expert knowledge probably transfers over, but a lot of it doesn't, and a lot of it will be contrary to the most productive things to do, right? So sometimes you need to be willing to just go out in the wild and try to find your way. And that's what we need right now. Like, you know, if you listen too much to what experts in today's systems tell you to do, you're going to drag yourself back toward today's systems because that's what they understand and that's what they know how to work on. Saying all games are bad at stories is like saying all movies are crap. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. No, it isn't like saying that. for reasons that I explained at length at the start of this talk. So if you didn't see that, you can go see it. What alternatives to games are there to accomplish imparting of intuition and motivation? I don't know. Like, this is a talk about games. That's what I've been thinking about with respect to this. How can we walk the edge in terms of using games for education, but not lose even more to destructive game addiction? Because I'm not sure to what degree destructive game addiction is really a thing. You know, like I've had addiction-like feelings with regard to playing video games, but only for short periods of time and not very often. It may be that some people are a lot more susceptible to that than other people, but I don't feel like this is a huge problem that we have. I feel like more what we have is that games are actually legitimately kind of interesting a lot of the time. And we don't acknowledge that societally. We don't acknowledge the way in which they're interesting, and we don't see that the way that they're interesting. And so we categorize spending a lot of time playing games as wasting time, when in reality, a lot of what happens, for example, in a classroom really is not that interesting and really is an annoying waste of time, right? And so we have our metrics reversed in that sense. And so I don't feel like there's a danger. I don't feel like we're on a precipice of games becoming too addictive or anything like that. That's not been my reality. Do I think increased privatization of schools could help create opportunities for these new and interesting types of learnings? Yes, but where we are at with this technology, it's up to us to prove that this is a good thing that can work before you can expect, for example, some privatized school to pick it up and run with it. Like, we actually have to build the thing before people can use it. You know what I'm saying? And so I wouldn't worry that much about private, like, you know, public schools, yes, it's a big institution that's hard to change. But so are private schools. Like, private schools have their own agendas that you may not agree with. They have their own ways of doing things. They're often pretty conservative. But at least, you know, private schools can come along that their reason for existing is to do their own thing and be a little experimental. And so, you know, occasionally maybe. Isn't it better to learn by doing the real thing instead of playing a game that simulates the thing, kind of? Yes, but, well, usually, not always. However, you can't always do the real thing, right? Like, doing real advanced mathematics, how do you get to where you can do that? You can't, like, sit a third grader down and say, you know, these are Lie algebras and blah, blah, blah. You know, here's group theory. They're not going to be able to do it. Most people. You have to get them there somehow. How do you communicate to people that your game went through many iterations? It's not a priority. So would I say that gamification is sort of trying to fight one vice with another? Yeah, sort of. I mean, it's not a value add in any way. Let's say that. When it comes to math and physics, checking if an answer is correct is an integral part of those disciplines, and you can't get rid of it. Providing the simulator that instantly checks doesn't make such sense to me. Yeah, I don't think that I would do it that way, but you're assuming a lot about what a good math game would look like, and I think the correct response is not to say that can't be good. It's to say that's not the good way to make a math game, right? Now, that may be the way a lot of math games are, but again, we've established most educational games are terrible. You understand what an if-else interaction in a video game code would look like. What would a systemic interaction look like? A systemic interaction is more like some math happens, some equations happen, and then maybe you have an if statement somewhere, but it's at the very edge. Like, if hit points goes below 0, then the barrel explodes, but there's a whole lot of things that affect hit points and how high or low they are, and proximity to the barrel is the degree to which they affect the barrel, right? That kind of thing makes it a system. Could I think of a game engine like Unity or Godot as an educational game in its own right? I wouldn't think of the existing things that way, but you could design something that way, yes. You spoke about games as utility and not as art. I feel the two are maybe not that separate. I don't think they're that separate. I mean, they're definitely pointing in slightly different directions, but they're not like orthogonal. Have I ever had a gameplay mechanic that I was divergent on? I.e. instant feeling versus gradual. I don't know what divergent on means. You mean that I didn't know how to decide which way it should be? Sometimes. You didn't quite understand how the tradition that I'm talking about is different from Miyagakure or Shenzhen-IO. That was the first question that I answered. Maybe we've got so many questions in the backlog that you didn't see that. I don't know. Is there a recommended reading list to pair with this lecture? No, I wish. What subject do you feel would benefit the most from me? I don't know. Please don't ask me what subject or what's the low-hanging fruit, because I don't totally know. That's, if you're interested in making that kind of game, it's kind of up to you to explore. But that's a good opportunity because, it means that you have something significant that you can do, that you can contribute. And the reason I don't totally know what the low-hanging fruit is because oftentimes to see that you need education in the subject already. And I don't have education in the majority of subjects. So I can't see what somebody who knows about a particular topic can see. How about Parable of the Polygons? It contains puzzles and is about a toy universe. I never played that. Don't you think that by the time we figure out how to make games like this, we will have neurotechnology advanced enough to directly inject knowledge into the brain, rendering education obsolete? Who can predict the future, right? I know I like what Neuralink is doing. I think it's good, but even they will tell you what they're working on is a long time out. Who knows what that will become, when it will become anything, and what it will be like, and who knows if it would supplant any particular kind of communication or not. I think it's unlikely that something like games would be completely replaced by any other technology, because that's just not really ever what we see, right? Again, Like writing didn't replace demonstration. Movies didn't replace music, even though movies are like a superset of music in some way, right? It's just it's a different thing. It's never what we say, what we see. My talk seems to focus on self-contained single-player games. I literally talked about PUBG for a long time. Do you think the economics of educational games don't incentivize my view of gamification? I don't care about the economics of currently existing educational games. I care about what we could make. Have I given any thought to ways these games could be misdirected? It seems that deliberately lack correspondence to real life concepts. I mean, sure, don't do that. The questions seem to keep scrolling in faster than I can go down them. How do I feel about using games as a way to criticize social systems? I mean, it's not my favorite thing. Because again, usually the way this is done is through like plot and setting and mood. And I think that that is much more effectively done in other genres of expression. I'm interested in what the system of a game will do. Do I see game making as a useful pedagogical tool? A bad analog being writing essays in humanities studies. Well, I do think writing essays in humanities studies is pretty terrible. It's not that useful, so I don't know why we still do it, except that you have to look like you're giving students work to do. We're certainly teaching people to be bad writers that way. I don't know. I think making games is too hard. It's way harder than writing essays, and writing essays doesn't even work that well, so why would you do it? A lot of people would say they like learning more after they got out of school. Well, I think the reasons for that are a lot of what we're saying, like we have never fully coped with. We have never fully solved the problem of how to communicate this knowledge that we societally have that we would like to impart to people, right? We have these factory-like ways of doing it that we call, the school system, and the school system does some things well, right? Like it's not like people come out of there completely without educations, but I think we can do a lot better, right? And I think if you did better, people would like it a lot more. Right? I think that goes hand in hand. Well, in most scenarios, those things go hand in hand. If we replace classical methodology, we may be risking our future since it brought us here. Yeah, I'm not suggesting completely, like I said during the talk, I'm not suggesting completely replacing an existing system. I'm suggesting building something as an alternative on the side that more and more people could opt into over time if it is effective and good. Traditional curriculum can move quickly between topics. How do you avoid needing a lot of different games focused on different points? Why not have a lot of games focused on different points? What's wrong with that? I mean, I don't see a problem with that. Am I aware of Brilliant.org? While not a game, you feel that the practical way that they're teaching various concepts has great potential for providing the intuition I was talking about. Let me see. Oh, I mean, so these kinds of I don't know. I mean, just from glancing at the homepage, it's not something I'm super familiar with. Um, just glancing at the homepage, it looks like a mixture of good ideas and bad ideas and tedious ideas all in a bag shaking up. So it's hard to say. Um, but I don't know because I don't really know. Seems to you that the small game, even a small game, is really hard to make if you want people to play it. So it's hard to try new things out when the risk and the cost are both so high. I mean, yes, but the risk and the cost are high no matter what. So you might as well do something interesting with that risk. That's always been my philosophy. I mean, like, I don't design regular games that are likely to be big sellers. I don't know if you noticed. It's just not my model, right? The other nice thing about doing a talk at home is it's so easy to adjust the temperature. Do I see room for development in the tradition of books for learning as well? For example, in The Thoughts of Why Books Don't Work by Andy Matuszek. I actually haven't read, I know Andy, but I haven't read that particular thing. So I'm taking the link into my buffer and I will read that later as well. Tyler says, wouldn't there be a risk in the system-based education game where the systems don't entirely map to the real world properly? It's possible the conclusions students could draw from exploring that end up being incorrect. Yeah, I said that during the talk, actually. I mean, the trick is that both the people making the games and the people playing them need to be clear that that is not what we're doing, right? We're not trying to represent an accurate system from which you should definitely map conclusions, right, from the fictional world to the real world. That is not, in general, going to be a correct thing to do or a feasible thing to do, right? So the challenge as a game designer is to find something that is useful educationally that does not require that step, right? And I think that's the kind of thing that sounds hard right now, but if you build a tradition of it, it becomes more obvious how to do it because you see a lot of examples. Oh my God, there's so much scroll back. I might have to skip a bunch of questions. There's questions I don't understand what they're asking. What do I think about educational tools that are just very goal-oriented and work in small increments, e.g. websites like Web Academy and other such basic programming educational tools? Is this similar to what games that educate players? I mean, I don't think so. Most of these things that I've seen they're not trying to teach you anything particularly deep or important. or I don't know. I shouldn't really say without looking at the sites in question, honestly. But I mean, if you have a program to teach people something in small increments and it works, and you have huge engagement and everybody successfully comes through it and knows what you wanted them to know with all the subtlety that you wanted them to know that thing, then that's successful and you probably don't need to tinker with that hardly at all, right? However, I don't think that describes almost anything, especially not new things being done in Silicon Valley that are educational. Okay, I'm just going to skip a ton of questions and go down toward the bottom. Because some of them are old, a lot of them are things that I've already answered and whatever. Tyler says, again, ever look at toys made for really young children? Many of them are basically meant to stimulate the brains of babies without like trying to teach any specific skill. It kind of seems like a version of what I'm promoting for games and education. Yeah, I would say that that's not completely dissimilar. I mean, it's interesting. I hadn't drawn that parallel. I think they're different things, but they're not like super different. They're not like opposite things, for example. Do I think the Montessori method is a better example of intrinsically motivated learning? I did not go to a Montessori school. I can't say much about it. I've not been a Montessori educator. Can't say much about that. So, I mean, I understand that part of the goal is to be intrinsically motivated, but I can't speak to whether it achieves that goal in a reasonable way or whether it comes at a cost. I would say that when it comes to any formalized system like Montessori or anything like that, if it were actually dramatically better at educating people in a straightforward way that was obvious to everyone, then it would have won, right? So like the fact that Montessori has been around for so long and it just hasn't won and taken over makes me think that, there's not a blatantly obvious educational advantage in terms of knowledge imparted. I mean, maybe that's not true, but I would guess, all other things being equal, that that's true. Now, maybe it makes other trade-offs. Maybe you're just a happier, more well-adjusted person after going through that, and that's worth, not learning more, or maybe learning, 5% less or whatever, and that's totally fine. But like, if it was actually better at getting you to know things substantially, I would guess that it would have won. Damn, what's going on with the... How is there 20 billion scroll back again? I just went down to the bottom. Have I talked to Alan Kay about this? No. Seems one of the main theses of my talk is that games can help develop tacit knowledge. Do you think the current education system underappreciates the role of tacit knowledge? Yes, I think that is the case quite strongly. Well, I think the system as a system underappreciates the role of tacit knowledge. I think the people who maybe write some of the textbooks or originally designed some of the educational programs from a high level understood the very important role of tacit knowledge, but the way it's structured is just like, look, the tacit knowledge will be transferred to you way later, like at the end, or maybe gradually over time by a good teacher through osmosis. And the thing is, I mean, that does work to some degree a little bit, but it also doesn't work to a large degree, right? Or people never get there. People never get to where they're going to pick up the tacit knowledge. Do I know about Khan Academy? Yes. Zach of Zachtronics has talked about making systems that are easy to teach, not necessarily ones that are applicable to real situations. Zach's point was that what's captivating about games is often killed when you prioritize teaching real-world knowledge. That sounds like the same thing I said, so I'm sorry if I just said the same things that Zach says, but that maybe that means we're both right. Do I feel like games have a place in the education system since its point was never to explore ideas and be interesting? Who says? How does multiplayer factor into the educational aspect of gaming? I mean, that's just a parameter. Some games could be multiplayer, others, don't have to be. Definitely multiplayer games that have a lot of players have like a system equilibrium finding aspect that doesn't occur very easily in single player games. Like single player games can have kind of broken or unbalanced systems, and most players might not notice it because they don't find the exploit. But multiplayer games will find the exploit, and so the system needs to be better. And that might mean it has more educational value, maybe. I don't know. I said earlier that I don't believe there's a problem with game addiction, but that seems to contradict claims I made in my video games in the human condition talk years ago, where I claimed that a lot of game design is about circumventing people's boredom and attempting to synthesize addiction. Well, yeah, I mean, both of those things are true. Like, on the one hand, a lot of these game designers are relatively unethical people who just are trying to get you addicted. On the other hand, it's not that easy. Like, some people, spend a lot of times in front of games because of that. But I think usually people get bored of it, right? Like for example, iOS games have gotten very boring. It's the same couple of things. They're basically not games, right? They're basically completely these kind of attempted addiction systems. And they do make a lot of money, so people are playing them, right? But actually, this is something that varies from country to country, because what I'm going to say now maybe doesn't apply in a lot of other places. But at least in the US, I feel like the heyday of people playing iOS games is a little bit in the past. Like they're still there, but they're not as big as they were before, because like people sort of acclimated to it, right? They said, oh yeah, we kind of know what this is. We got what we were going to get out of this stimulation wise. And like, it's kind of boring now, right? Because nothing new was offered there. Now, I do know that when I've traveled in certain parts of Asia, I've seen much more in the way of like mobile games being a huge part of active everyday culture there. But like here, I don't feel like that's true in the same way. And so it's just to say that like, yes, both things are true. There are game designers out there doing stuff that I really don't like. On the other hand, it's not like a threat to society right now, I don't think. Do I think games could help people understand mental health? Probably. But, am I familiar with the work of Brett Victor? Yeah, totally. But what he does is a little bit different from what I'm talking about here. So maybe it's hard to find a comment on the through line. What do I think about explaining philosophical concepts through video games? I mean, I want to keep it on topic, right? I mean, also, there's been a lot of random questions about what do you think about doing a game that does blah? And I'm like, well, I mean, I was talking about a specific thing today, which is using the genre-specific capabilities that games have to communicate in a way that other things can't, right? And if you can find a way, start with that. Start with the thing that games good at that games are good at that nobody else is good at, and see what you can use that for. If you can use that for philosophy, then use that for philosophy. If you can't, then don't. But like starting the other way around is more like you're throwing darts at a wall where you don't even know if the target's on the wall. You know, it's like, it doesn't seem that productive to me. There's a pretty big cohort of educators who are totally against grades. Is that a step in the right direction or a step backward? I mean, I think you could do a good system that didn't have grades, but I do think you need something, you know? Like if you had something like, you know, medals in the army where they don't just give them out, like that could be a thing, right? And you just wouldn't need grades and you'd be like, oh, this person got these. But that would not look like the gamification thing that we have right now, right? I want to stress very clearly that would be a different thing. What did I end up doing with the Feynman diagram game? Nothing. It's just on my hard drive. Do I think that folks in school might use games as a means of escaping education? The fact that folks in school might use games as a means of escaping education makes it harder to use as a medium for education? No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't know what else to say about that. I don't think that that's a concern. You think a big part of learning is still essentially repetitive drudge work? Well, playing PUBG is repetitive drudge work, but people still want to do it. The question is whether the repetitive drudge work goes in a direction that's intrinsically interesting or not, right? Which sounds like a paradox, but it's actually not. And we know that because we have examples from games like all the time. You think Albino Raccoon was getting at the Prussian education model, routine memorization for assembly line workers? Would that dichotomy need to be broken for game education to work? Well, that's not the kind of thing that I'm interested in talking about here or that I'm trying to promote. I'm trying to promote systems that lead eventually to deep expertise. If your job is to just get people to memorize a bunch of facts, then maybe you just want to do spaced repetition learning or something, and you don't need video games, and that's fine. But what I'm talking about here is a different thing. Feels like the cost to try to revolutionize education through games could be too high since games teach that useful concepts are insanely difficult to make. And the market is quite small since the majority of people prioritize fun. My whole point was that these games are fun. That was my whole point. Again, if you visualize a traditional educational game, that's not what I'm talking about. I agree those games are bad. I'm not saying to make those. If we could fully simulate a chemistry lab, do I think people would make it and learn from it? I mean, I think if you could do that, you would do it in such a way that it was not identical to the real world chemistry lab. Would I still uphold the Feynman diagram game as a good example of educational games? No, because that game's not done. You can't play it. Nobody can sit down and play that Feynman diagram game. I was just using an example of something I was working on that was, to the degree that it was worked on, that was consistent with these ideas that I'm putting forth. Is it a problem that a system like this would be inherently biased toward logic-based classes? No, because it's not. It's not biased toward anything. Not really. Because again, we're not trying to make these things where you memorize facts or whatever like you would from a book. So that's not the point, right? So like, if you wanted to teach history or something, right, then like the reason that people learn history well is usually if they find it interesting, if they're interested in the subject matter. And if you know something about the subject matter, you might be more interested. And so, for example, um, knowing all the history of Rome with, Caesar and all these things, um, you might remember that stuff better if you had a visual to tie it to. And that visual might be like any random, military formation game that you played or something. Or like, I'm trying to think of a better example. I had one and then I dropped it because it's been hours. Um, could even drive students away further from knowledge-based classes like history. So, like a historical event, like a negotiation that was attempted and failed or something, right? If you've played games about negotiation, if you've done negotiation, that gives you a little hook to understand that, right? And that hook doesn't have to be about history. It can just be about negotiation. Do you know what I'm saying? It applies from a different direction in a different way. Am I familiar with The Mathematician's Lament? It voices a lot of the same complaints. I think I read this a long time ago. The thing is, every time I read that title, I feel like it's the book by Hardy about how math is terrible. I don't remember. Yeah, I've read this. One of the premises of your talk was that natural human curiosity compels people to explore game systems and discover their dynamics. Am I sure this doesn't only hold for a subset of people? No, it holds for all people because it's an evolutionarily instilled drive. It's universal. Is there a problem of incurious students? Like, on the one hand, curiosity is kind of a strategy. You can have people that are more curious about any random topic or less curious than any random topic, but everybody has some things that they're interested in. And if you can connect to those things that they're interested in, they'll probably be interested. Aren't games intrinsically about being in a low responsibility state? No, I don't think so, unless I misunderstand what you're saying by that. Seems like almost every time an innovative game comes out, it teaches unexpectedly in the way you describe. As soon as we discuss education, everyone starts talking about Feynman and philosophy games. Yeah, I mean, yes, that's part of the problem, right? Like I was saying in the talk, all games are educational games. And so if as soon as you say the phrase educational games, you have to start talking about this specific thing, you kind of already lost the fight, right? The fight is won by starting with the games that we have that are good, not by starting with the educational games that we have that are bad. You know what I'm saying? This camera being crooked is bothering me. I'm skipping more questions. There's also the horrid phrase serious games, which was in vogue for a while. Yeah, I was going to put that in this talk, and it was just too long. Like, honestly don't know how this became an hour and a half talk. It was 36 minutes last time I gave it. And I did add some stuff. But like, I also just spoke slower because I wanted to, and I actually didn't do as good of a job explaining a couple things as I wish I did. I don't know. Hopefully it made sense and people got something out of it. You say games, the thing games are good for is for building intuition. Do you see high-hanging fruit for which intuition does a poor job of capturing the salient aspect of a system? I mean, that's a weird question because you're sort of asking a question about there's two ways to take that question. One is about the space of all things that we could learn or understand or be good at. And we don't know what that space looks like, right? That's a space mostly unknown to us. What we know is what we are able to learn and understand and communicate and be good at. And that's a subset of the whole space, right? And so if you're saying, is there something that intuition isn't good at helping people understand with in the big space, I'd say like probably there's huge portions of that big space that we don't even have the conceptual language to talk about yet, right? If you mean relative to the current educational system, are there things that imparting intuition via games is bad at helping with? I would say probably, yeah. Like, look, well, it depends. I mean, like if your goal is to memorize a bunch of things, you just got to memorize a bunch of things. You just have to know these things, right? Intuition, like memorizing things, is not fundamentally about intuition. But again, you may remember things better if you're able to categorize them and put them in context better, which the intuition may help with. So I don't know. You would have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. Did I ever beat kelp harvesting robot in Shenzhen? I beat all the levels from the original game when it was first released. Like Zachtronics does this thing where they like take out all the good levels a couple weeks after release and then add a bunch more. And I didn't play after that happened. I played it like right when it came out. So whatever was in it at that time, I've done all of. Is the next step going to be to keep exploring good game design, or do I think I want to research some specific topic? I just have a lot of work to do right now. I'm like making a programming language and games, multiple games. So yeah. All right. I think I'm going to sign off here, everybody. Thank you for coming by. I've been talking for 3 hours straight. Actually more than that, because I did a run through of my talk alone today. So I did 4.5 hours of talking today. Thanks for coming by. This will be on YouTube eventually if you missed part of it. I want to edit out some stuff like the time that we lost the net connection and so forth. Thanks, everybody.